The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the central claim of Christian theology. As the Apostle Paul put it in 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. But is belief in Christ's resurrection a matter of faith only, or can it also be demonstrated historically? That's the question I asked Dr. Gary Habermas in this episode of the Influence Podcast. I'm George B. Wood, executive editor of Influence Magazine, and your host. Dr. Gary Habermas is Distinguished Research Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy at Liberty University. He is the author or co-author of more than 30 books, most recently, Risen Indeed, a historical investigation into the resurrection of Jesus, published in 2021 by Lexham Academic. Habermas is widely considered the nation's foremost apologist on the historicity of Christ's resurrection. My conversation with him is coming up after a brief word from our sponsor. This episode of the Influence Podcast is brought to you by My Healthy Church, distributors of Bible Engagement Project. Bible Engagement Project gives churches access to a library of kids' curriculum and small group resources all in one subscription. Visit BibleEngagementProject.com to download sample lessons. And now, Dr. Gary Habermas. Welcome to the Influence Podcast, Dr. Habermas.
I'm very happy to be here with you. This is a great topic. You hit the nail on the head there, and it's wonderful to be thinking through it with you today.
So, as I said in the introduction, I want to talk to you about whether the resurrection of Jesus Christ can be demonstrated historically. But first, I want to start with a definitional question. When we talk about Christ's resurrection, what do we mean by the word resurrection? And I ask that specifically because it seems like there's a difference between Christ's resurrection and his raising of people in the gospel, let's say the son of the widow of Nain or Lazarus. So what is Christ's resurrection, and how is that different than those other resurrections that he performs in the gospels?
Yeah, great question. You've also got the Old Testament resurrections with Elijah and Elisha and so on. So, and they're similar to the three that Jesus did that you're talking about. To me, this is why some theologians call Lazarus's resurrection, they call it a resuscitation, and Jesus's is a resurrection. I'm not happy with that, because I think anybody who's been dead for 4 days is truly dead. I mean, after all, that line about why you can open up the tomb, by now he stinks. That line, he was raised. So I think rather than saying resuscitation and resurrection, we've got to do something like resurrection 1 and 2. And in the lower, simpler form of resurrection, we're talking about a person who's raised for a temporary amount of time, and as far as we know, must die again. Jesus's, as the whole book of Hebrews makes a fantastic argument, he's the Son of God who is raised and goes to heaven after he appears for, as Luke said, 40 days. And he went to heaven, sits on the right hand of God, intercedes for us forever, because this priest doesn't die and won't die again. So for me, the biblical definition of Jesus's resurrection is a unique, one-of-a-kind event. We don't know anybody else that we celebrate, even our loved ones in Christ. We don't think they've been raised with resurrected bodies, so they've already died, and they're not coming back here, but they're awaiting their resurrection bodies. Jesus was for a few days away from his body, is the most common. That they think what happened to Jesus or what happens to believers for maybe many years until Christ returns. But for Jesus, he had that very short disembodied time, followed by just not a re-embodied time, but a re-glorified embodied time, never to die again. And Orthodox Christianity thinks that Jesus is still in a body today in heaven. He still has his glorified body. So I would say that it's a long conversation, because Jesus' resurrection is totally unique. It's a one of a kind. No other founder of a world religion is believed to be there, and no other Christian who's died and awaiting Christ's return is there yet either. So it's a unique definition.
So I think as I'm listening to you, I mean, when we talk about resurrection, we're talking about something that happens. It's not spiritual, or it's not metaphorical. It's physical, or it's bodily, maybe is the way to put it. But
Right.
the difference then between resurrection 1 and 2 is that the raised body is different because it's glorified. And of course that's our future. What Christ now is, in terms of the resurrection, at least, not in terms of his divinity, but in terms of his resurrected body, that's our hope too, that we also will be raised with him, correct?
Correct. In fact, uh, the resurrection is this Jesus's resurrection. That's what I mean when I say the resurrection. Um, is in the New Testament linked to almost every area of theology and most areas of practice. So it's tied in with everything. And one the one doctrine that's tied in the most to the resurrection of Jesus is just what you said. It's the resurrection of believers. And we're told we're told almost 20 times in the New Testament that we will be raised just like Jesus. I mean, Paul says it best, maybe Philippians 3, where he says he will change our vile body to be like unto his glorious body. So we're exchanging bodies, but or 2 Corinthians 5, we're giving up the old one, and when there's a delay, and then we're joined by the new one. That of course already happened to Jesus. So again, we're talking not just uniqueness here, but the fact that Christians will be raised similarly, and that is, I can't think of a better hope that would fulfill 1 Corinthians, those verses you're reading, because we're raised. He says in verse 17 that our loved ones who died in Christ have died in vain if he has not been raised from the dead. And but since he's raised, we will be raised that way. So that is the pattern for him. That's the pattern for us.
So theologians sometimes distinguish the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. Skeptics pick up on this distinction and drive a wedge between the two, claiming that the historical Jesus was nothing like the Christ of later Orthodox Christianity. And in fact, there's even a few, it's a very small minority, but they're very loud. A few radical skeptics deny that Jesus ever even existed. So a lot of what we're going to be talking today depends on scholarly consensus about basic facts, right?
Right.
So let me just ask, in reply to these kind of radical skeptics, especially, is there a scholarly agreement on basic elements of Jesus' life and teaching?
I think now someone who's in that field, one of these well-placed skeptics, they're going to hear me say this, and they're going to want to give all kinds of qualifications. But in general, yes, there are a particular number of facts throughout Jesus's public ministry, which we typically say went on for about 3 years. And there are a number of facts which conservatives and liberals, not just liberals, atheist New Testament scholars, of which there's more than we might think, agnostic New Testament scholars, non-Christian professors that are that's one of the fields they could teach, and they may be a Jewish New Testament or a Jewish theologian, and they can speak on New Testament issues. All of those, from the far right to the far left, are going to have a body of facts to which they agree.
And so those things, I'm thinking here of like Bart Ehrman. So for a lot of evangelicals, Bart Ehrman is kind of like the bête noire. He's the guy that was one of us, and then he left us, and then he writes all these books, and we're very upset. But he wrote a book called "Did Jesus Even Exist?" I think it was the title of the book, in which he said, "Look, we know that Jesus existed, that he taught about the kingdom of God, that he died on a cross, that he, that his disciples claimed that he performed miracles, that his disciples claimed that." He rose again from the dead. Those seem to be at least 6 basic data points that scholars across the spectrum agree with. Are there others maybe that get thrown in there?
Yeah, there are a lot. In fact, that book of Bart's, it's called "Did Jesus Exist?" That book is, well, let's put it this way. I only teach at the PhD level, so there's things I would say to PhD students that I would not say to undergrads. But because PhDs will understand what I'm saying, they'll take it with the right nuance. The younger students, especially undergrads, they'll leave and think I'm saying something that's totally off the bat, and they don't catch the context. But for the PhD students, I require when I teach this, it's kind of a seminar. It's not a required PhD class, but it's kind of a free for all. And I teach one on the historical Jesus. I require that book by Bart Ehrman, and I require it because, as I tell my PhD students, if you realize that Bart Ehrman is, well, he says I'm an atheist in some matters and agnostic in others. But if you realize that he is comfortable with the word agnostic about at least part of his views, it's amazing that you know he's going to disagree with you in a number of areas. I mean, he's an atheist. So he's going to say the Gospels are not reliable. He's going to say Jesus probably didn't do real miracles during his life. He's going to question, for sure, he'll question the empty tomb. He used to believe in the empty tomb, and now he's changed his view. And he used to believe Jesus was buried in a tomb. Now he's changed that view, and he thinks Dom Crossan is probably right, and he was buried in a common grave or buried in the ground. And he definitely doesn't believe in appearances. Okay, well, then why would you use his book for required? Because put those things aside, and they're pretty major for sure, but he gives so many positive reasons in the books, the Gospels that he says are not reliable. He sure defends enough things from it. Well, I'll give you one example. Jesus' crucifixion is obviously a precursor to his resurrection, and Bart Ehrman lists 15 different independent sources that back up the crucifixion and tell us why it's unassailable as a fact. 15 different independent sources, and a few of them are not even in the New Testament. But I think many people would even be interested into why he even cites the New Testament, because the non-scholarly Jesus mythicists that he kind of despises in that book, he goes off on them. That's why he's writing the book, and he's going after them. He goes after them hard for a lot of pages, uses very strong language against the mythicists, but they'll act like, well, you can't quote the New Testament, it's prejudice. Well, I tell my students, they say that to other lay people who are Christians, and then Christians think that's what everybody says. Bart Ehrman says nothing like that, and the other New Testament skeptics say nothing like that. They will only use verses from the Gospels that are evidenced in one way or another. And there's one example, 15 sources for Jesus' crucifixion. So they will, I tell people, if you don't use verses with a Bart Ehrman or someone like him, they'll use more verses than you'll use. The book is filled with New Testament verses, but they think they're texts that are reliable for certain reasons. They just don't think the whole books are reliable, but things in them are reliable. And so I think what he does is very much worthwhile, very honest, and very helpful to the church, especially grad class.
Yeah, and so we're going to get into that, because I think that is a precursor. Understanding, where there is consensus among scholars is a precursor to what I think it's now called the minimal facts approach to proving or demonstrating Jesus' resurrection.
What I call that, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you do have to be aware of that kind of scholarly argument. One other thing that skeptics often question, the historical value of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, because those accounts narrate miracles, either miracles Jesus performs, or in the case of his resurrection, the miracle that God performed upon Jesus. So, we have this data point that Ehrman and other, agnostic New Testament scholars make, is that certainly in the opinion of the immediate followers of Jesus, they thought he performed miracles. And so then they get into this philosophical dispute about whether miracles actually happened. But from a historical matter, clearly people who followed Jesus believed that he was performing miracles.
Yes.
But if you believe that miracles actually can occur, do miracle accounts necessarily lessen the historical value of the information that we find in the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament?
Well, I read very widely in this area. In fact, I tell my grad students I read more as far to the left as I can read, but scholars, not the guys that go off and they just go off for no reason. They don't have degrees, they don't have any credentials, but they just go off on New Testament. That's not the guys I read. But the real scholars, yeah, I read way more of those than I read evangelicals. And I can tell you, while Bart takes a little stronger stance on Jesus actually did healings, he's a little more questioning. The majority of were scholars that are right where he is, one critic, this is a critic now, said that 100%. Now that's an overstatement by someone who's to the left of liberals, and I'd say 100% is an overstatement. But he said that 100% of scholars today believe Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. Now you have to stop and say, what does healer and exorcist mean? And you were touching on those things. They can say Jesus really did exorcisms, but we personally don't believe in demons. But we believe Jesus was doing, here's the point, he was doing the things that the gospel says he was doing. The locals believed they were demon-possessed. Jesus pronounced them demon-possessed, and he cast the demon out. And for whatever reason, it could be cognitive psychology that pastors use with people today. For whatever reason, the person who had this happen to them seemed to come out of it and be very, very strong afterwards. Whatever it was, they were a fit person to live with, and they weren't before. So they really think that and the healings, did Jesus really heal people? Well, yes, the critics will say he did, at least psychosomatically, because we know from medicine today that there are certain cognitive counseling techniques that both Christian and non-Christian counselors share, because the so-called cognitive method is so well demonstrated in science. They do think that Jesus did these cognitive healings, that when he told someone, you're fine, he was such a major magnetic personality, they believed him. And believing him that they were fine, they acted like they were fine. And we don't know what they were like 5 years down the road, but they were legitimately changed. So scholars to a T, they don't like the critics still don't like the nature miracles. He stilled the storm. And John Dominic Crossan, another big name critic, he'll say the biggest nature miracle of all is the resurrection. So they don't do much with the nature miracles, but healings and demonic confrontations, whatever was going on, yeah, those things happened. So the cases in the Gospels either happened or ones just like them happened. And that's true of the historical Jesus. That's where they are right now. And it's pretty much agreed that Jesus was this magnetic figure and really did things just like it. So.
And of course, Christians are going to want to go beyond just psychosomatic or cognitive type miracles and say, no, actually, God supernaturally worked there. But sure. from a historical point of view, you can't use the fact that the Gospels report a miracle to say that nothing ever happened. That maybe was what happened, let's say, with Thomas Jefferson and his famous or infamous, edit of the New Testament to literally scissor out every account of miracles. That may have been true in the 18th or 19th century, but I think modern scholars seem to be more open to saying that when the Gospels say that Jesus was a miracle worker, an exorcist, that's in fact how people perceived him historically in his own day. And that's all I wanted to establish on that point.
Yeah, there's absolutely no question whatsoever that that's how he was perceived. It was not only his view, but he was perceived by others who were there in the Jewish worldview and mindset of the day. Yes, you're definitely right. They all thought he was doing that. I don't know anybody who would say they didn't think he was really doing that.
So you pioneered what is called the minimal facts approach to demonstrating the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. And maybe a maximal facts approach would be just to say that whatever the Gospels in the New Testament purports to, be historical is historical. If that's the maximal facts approach, what is the minimal facts approach? Why do you think that it's useful for demonstrating the historicity of the resurrection? And what are the minimal facts that you rely on in this approach?
Sure.
That's actually three different questions, but they're all related.
Sure,
so.
It is, but they're good questions. Yeah, what you're calling a maximal approach, I think there are many, many ways to get to the reliability. And then after you get reliability, apologists move from there to inspiration. But the general reliability, the New Testament, the Gospels are trustworthy. There are many ways to get there. In fact, my research assistant, who has been my research assistant for so long, he's already earned his PhD in the same area, and he's published 20 things now. This guy has done a PowerPoint on how many different ways there are to show the New Testaments are reliable. And he's got 13 of them, 13 different arguments to show they're not arguments per se, they're argument structures. So each one of them would have many sub-arguments, but there's about 13 different ones. I think the minimal facts argument is a minimal way to do reliability of the Gospels. However, I'm only doing a minimal number of gospel facts. It'd be like if somebody said, take a Craig Keener, for example. He doesn't say this, but if Craig were to say, my whole ministry, he's got 3 huge books now on miracles, modern miracles, and Jesus's, and he would, if he were to make the claim, which he doesn't, but if he were to make the claim, my whole ministry is zeroing in on the Gospels for the miracle accounts. Well, that would be a limited reliability account because he's arguing for just one thing. And but he thinks the rest of the Gospels are fine. That's a good analogy for me, because I think the Gospels are reliable, and I think my research assistant hit the nail on the head when he does like over a dozen of these. But I'm just doing one, and my point is to say, what I do is I take a list of 12 facts that are pretty much agreed to by everybody, and then I say, hey, 6 of these are really agreed to by everybody by a very narrow a percentage, very close to 100. I mean, somewhere in the 90s probably, and they will treat these 6 facts very well, the next 6 facts quite well, and at least these 12 things we could know in great detail. A lot of people misunderstand me, and so they think the whole 12 are called minimal facts. No, I mean, I think they're all reliability facts, but I go down and take just 6. And here's the 6 that I use for minimal arguments. Number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. And I've already said, here's Bart Ehrman, the atheist New Testament scholar, who gives 15 independent sources for this event and says none of the scholars deny this. Well, that's one. Number 2, the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. You're going to have to look hard to find one critic who disagrees with that. They all think the Gospels report and Paul reports, and happened to Paul, if you believe the reports, that there was a visual, something happened, and they were convinced it was visual. They were convinced they saw Jesus. They didn't buy this story because there's other pagan stories that have been out there forever, and they just thought, oh yeah, Jesus is one of those. It's not that. They claimed not to know a story, but to have seen something, and to have seen something in groups. And that's very important. And so that's the second one. They were convicted. They saw the risen Jesus, some kind of experience, and virtually nobody is going to deny that. Thirdly, third and fourth, these two happen almost simultaneously, so it's hard to know which one comes first. But the disciples were immediately transformed. I mean, immediately. There's a lot of difference between what happens on what we call Good Friday, what we sometimes call Black Saturday, kind of a downer day. I mean, I'm sure these disciples are thinking, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to tax collecting. What in the world did I do for 3 years? I kind of partially left my family because they had trips to go back. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law and so on. They had trips to go back, but for the most part, they didn't see their families. They lived outside. They used rocks for pillows. They made great sacrifice. And now they're going, what in the world did I do? Bad Saturday. Then Sunday morning, the women come and say, hey, we went to the tomb to finish the process and take some spices. And we saw an angel, and Jesus appeared. And in Luke 24, verse 11, we read, the disciples didn't believe them. They thought their women were spreading idle tales, almost a too good to be true thesis. And they basically called it gossip. They were spreading idle tales. Then a couple of disciples run to the tomb, find the tomb empty. And here's what happens. In the next 40 days, there was a cannon. If you can think of a timeline, there's a cannon that goes off somewhere there at the crucifixion or the next day, and going forward, these fellas are so transformed. The women too. Jesus had a lot of people. 3 women in particular were told underwrote Jesus's ministry out of their own pocketbooks. So men and women there in the early church, it was a cannon fire. Something blew out of Jerusalem, and it went far and fast. In fact, George, this is an aside, but I'll just say this. Years ago, they used to say that the disciples didn't it took them until the Gospel of John to unpack what was really going on. In other words, Gospel of John, 95 AD, subtract 30. Jesus died in 30 AD. 65 years later, it's the Gospel of John. It took over a half a century to unpack the heavy stuff that Jesus was teaching. Now they're changing this, and there's a phrase they're using that is very, very powerful. These are critics, and here's the phrase they use. The earliest Christology was the highest Christology. It was the highest at the beginning. Now, my question is, if coming out of the gate a few months after the cross, if the Christology was the highest, what in the world happened? What was this cannon that went off that propelled them? Just the world's never seen this before. Well, it was their belief that Jesus was raised. And the fourth thing is that it was very, very early. Critics now say that the preaching of the resurrection happened immediately. They didn't go think about it for 5 years and decide to become pastors. It was immediate. Garrett Ludeman, unfortunately, another atheist New Testament scholar, but he just passed away just about exactly a year ago. And Garrett Ludeman said the preaching began immediately after the cross. We go, wow. The book of Acts says 50 days later, Peter's preaching the first quote-unquote Christian sermon where Jesus is not around and his followers are taken over. And 50 days later, well, he said immediately they were preaching it, and there were thousands of converts. So, and there's ways to show that's probably the strongest fact right now. The earliness of this preaching is huge. And then my last two facts are James and Peter, two skeptics, two unbelievers, as far as we know, for sure with Paul and probably with James, were unbelievers before they saw the risen Jesus. All of a sudden, they're not just in the camp. They're both called apostles, and James becomes basically the de facto pastor of the church in Jerusalem, he and Peter. But things are happening, and those 6 facts, to me, show that there's only one credible explanation, and it was the resurrection of Jesus.
Right. So your argument, I mean, in philosophical terms, your argument takes the form of an inference to the best explanation. Given the data, we go through a number of hypotheses to say, well, these hypotheses may explain the data, and then the one that best explains the data is considered the most reasonable inference. If I got the logical structure about right?
Yeah, that's fair. The inference to the best explanation is usually called abductive reasoning, and we have deductive, inductive, and abductive is kind of a lesser known but very strong argumentative. And argumentative method. I flip back and forth between the inductive and the inference the best explanation. So that's a good way to go after it. If we had all this data, which is the best? Now, critics might say, hey, you're right. It's the best explanation. But those things don't happen. They just don't happen. We know this world is out there because I can look out my window and see the trees. But we can't look out the window and see resurrection. So your guy's biggest problem is that you believe in a view that can't be verified, i.e., there's another world. And there's fantastic comebacks to that. But that's why they stumbled. Not that it's the best data, but what it is evidencing that they just don't have a category for.
Okay, so that's really, that abductive style of argument, the inference to the best explanation, that's really the basis of my next 2 questions. And so the first question that I want you to do is to say how the resurrection is the best explanation of inference. And then after that, I'll come back and ask you again about why the inference to the best explanation most likely rules out all of these other non-miraculous accounts. Okay, so let's start with how do these minimal facts, how do you infer the resurrection from these minimal facts?
Well, it comes in steps, and I would say, first of all, if critics and unbelievers share a belief in these 6, and by the way, Richard Carrier, the well-known super skeptic who says Jesus probably never lived, he has a passage in one of his books where he says Habermas has 12 facts. I'm okay with all of them but the empty tomb. That's just an example. he's out there further than almost anybody, and he, except for the empty tomb, he at least seems to be fine with the other 11 facts. Okay, so if I'm going to get those facts, the empty tomb, by the way, is part of my second 6. But uh, if I'm allowed to use those facts, I'm going to say, here's why maybe I'll be putting your two questions together and maybe not differentiating enough, but I would say, if you as a critic hear my facts and you agree to them as much as I do, you tell me what naturalistic theory works. Now, let me explain for your listeners what a naturalistic theory is. Here's a naturalistic theory that critics use. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What really happened was fill in the blank, and you put your theory in there. This is not a naturalistic theory. That's a bunch of bunk. I don't believe that. All that is a disaffirmation. Christians can respond to the second one like this. Well, I'm sorry. I do believe he's been raised from the dead. And critics will say, all you did was state your faith. You don't have any reasons. And the Christian says, sorry, that's what you just did. You said he didn't rise from the dead. You're just stating your view. To the response to he didn't rise is, no, he did rise. We say he's risen indeed. But if a person wants to say, no, he didn't rise, I want you to fill in that blank. I want you to say, Christ didn't rise from the dead. What happened was, tell me your theory. And today, there is a decreasing number of critics who will pick a theory. Bart Ehrman he might say, well, it didn't go down exactly like this, but it appears from his books that he used to like the hallucination theory. I think he still kind of likes it a little bit, but in a later book, he says, I'm not going to pick a theory anymore. I'm just going to say that resurrection is so wild, you don't have to pick a theory. These things don't happen. And he goes to that view. But it's the older critics. Two of them have just died in the last year. Garrett Ludeman and John Shelby Spong. They both had theories, but anymore, there are very few well-known scholars who take a naturalistic theory. John Dominic Crossan, who's about as skeptical as Bart Ehrman is, Dom Crossan says, I don't accept naturalistic theories. I don't accept them. And a growing number, even if they are open to them, to naturalistic theories, they don't pick one. And here's why they don't. I was in a debate with a guy one time, an atheist, and I said, well, why don't you pick a theory? If you want to go up against my view, just don't say you don't like it. That's a disaffirmation. And my response is, I'm sorry, I believe in the resurrection. Why don't we try to make some more ground? Why don't you tell me why you don't believe in the resurrection? Make up a theory. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And I said, what do you mean you're not going to do that? I'm a supernaturalist. I'll tell you my supernatural theory. Jesus was raised. You're a naturalist. You believe nothing happened actually to Jesus. So you must have a reason that you think, if to be satisfied with your own view, you must have a naturalistic view. And he said, nope, not going to do it. So why not? He said, because if I pick one, this is really what he said. If I pick one, you're going to get me in a corner and I'm going to be uncomfortable. You're going to give me a whole bunch of data that say my view's false, and then where I go. And I said, that's exactly the problem. If you get in the corner by picking any one little series, so that now most critics don't like these grandiose topics. It's usually the older folks. And like I said, two of them passed away in the last year. It's older people, older critics who take a single view. They don't do that so much. So today, they're just willing to say, oh, that stuff doesn't happen. There's no Narnia. There's no Middle Earth. It's nice fairy tale, but that's why your view is a fairy tale. It belongs in the fairy tale category, not in the historical category. That doesn't happen in history. So that's a really nice denial. Let me once again tell you, I think it does belong in our world. Now, where do you go? And I try to get them to take a theory, and they frequently don't want to take one. Bart Ehrman, interestingly enough, says, when I was an evangelical, he's a graduate of Moody and Wheaton, he said, I used to do that all the time. And I tried to get them to pick a theory. And then we'd nail them. And he said, we would just kill them with responses. In fact, he called the swoon theory, the 60s phrase. He said, back in those days, we used to say it was a death warmed over theory. That's funny. So they're the ones with the issues, because they cannot explain what really happened. They just say, well, I deny it. I deny it is not a theory. Tell me why it didn't happen. Tell me why I shouldn't believe it. Well, because those things aren't real. Is that all you can say? I say those things are real. Now, where do we get past this impasse? So that's a little bit of an issue. If they're not going to pick a theory, I think right away they're behind the eight ball, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important point to emphasize for our listeners, because if you don't believe that the resurrection happened, but you do agree on these six minimal facts, you have to come up with a historical explanation for why these six minimal facts took place.
Right.
Meaning you have to come up with a naturalistic explanation to account for the historical, let's say the historical conversion of Paul and James, or the reason why there was such a radical change in the disciples, or why high Christology is the earliest Christology. You have to come up with some reasonable historical explanation. If you can't, then you're just arguing metaphysics. And that's fine, but metaphysics isn't history. They operate as very different, academic disciplines, and they have different rules. And I think that that's the point that I really want to emphasize for listeners, that if people try to come up with a historical explanation of the minimal facts, then they're going to have to deal with the fact that there are devastating counter arguments to those. So you've mentioned the swoon theory. Obviously that, Jesus died. Okay, that's a minimal fact. It's hard to make sense of that. But what about, people had hallucinations, or this was a spiritual vision? Well, here the problem is that doesn't really account for how can you have mass hallucinations, or do hallucinations actually produce radical change in not only individuals but in communities? Or, you could go through all of those. Is that basically what you're arguing?
Yes, exactly. With hallucination, you go down the line and you say, well, how about groups? I've co-authored an article in a European journal with a medical doctor who, and then also another one of my friends is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, which is like the top of the line. They're like the medical people in the psychology realm. They can even go back to school and be able to give them the right to pass out medicine like an MD can. And so this clinical psychologist on one side and the medical doctor, both of whom I've done things with, they have both looked at their own disciplines and gone back something like 25 years. And they say there are no documented accounts of mass hallucinations. Now, there are mass events. There are events where people in a group can be convinced of something, like something crazy. You could have a group of one political view and give them a real powerful message at the end. A whole bunch of the ones have changed their view, and now they take the other view. There are mass events where when groups are together, they say and hear and think different things, but that's not an hallucination. So a lot of people say, oh, yeah, no, there are people who have changed. What about you go to a magic show and everybody there thinks the guy really pulled a rabbit out of a hat, to use a dumb example. But we all saw it. But see, magicians are called illusionists. An illusion is where you really see something, but you interpret it as something else. I went hunting and I saw Bigfoot. And then we go out there and it was right here. And we got some tracks and we take them, and it was a giant grizzly bear. They really did see something, but they misinterpreted the data. So when people say we have a lot of group events, true, but not group hallucinations. And that's a great comeback. And you listed several. And to that list you gave, I would also say, I asked my graduate students, the empty tomb is the next one I would bring in. If I had to have a 7, I would bring the empty tomb has many arguments for it as the 6 do. It just doesn't have as much scholarly agreement. But the empty tomb, I'll say to them, is hallucination an empty tomb view or a full tomb view? And they'll say, no, hallucination's a full tomb view, meaning that body will still be in the grave, but the body wasn't in the grave. So empty tomb is a huge comeback against hallucination. You raised one earlier in the broadcast here, the changed lives. Do people who see hallucinations, are they as crazy in a good way as the original apostles who went everywhere presenting? What kind of hallucination ever does something like shoot these guys out of a cannon and come up with this high Christology? So there's a whole bunch of comebacks. I've got an article. It's online. It's on my website, GaryHabermas.com, where I have 19 refutations of hallucination, but that's because there's different forms of hallucination theory, and I take it in levels. So there are many, many comebacks, but that's still probably the most popular view. But since I do head count on where guys are, when I say it's the most popular view, critics who publish this and say so, I'm not talking about what views they hold over the coffee table in their university, but when they publish that view, there are not that many who take hallucination. And it's probably the most popular comeback. So if that's where we are, and they are left to saying, yeah, but there's no Narnia and no Middle Earth and no Christian heaven, there are comebacks to that. In fact, Georgia, I mean, I don't want to get you on a whole other topic, but second to the resurrection, the topic that I've probably done the most research on, I've been doing it since 1972, so it's been a long time. I didn't start it last week. Is near-death experiences, and I published an article in a secular publication just a few years ago, and now they've asked me to revise it for another publication. Is that there are over 300 evidence near-death experiences, where I mean, it's super high level of evidence that this person notices something where they're out of their body. And as far as the doctors know, they had no brain or heart activity at all. But they know when the event occurred because it was a car accident, for example. There's a medical report, and we know that's after you went down. Now, why would I bring this up? I know it's huge and it can dominate conversations easily because people like it. But here's my point. NDEs, if they really happened, show you that there's another world. It is the best evidence to me. There's a lot of good ones, but NDEs are the best evidence that there is, in fact, if you take my next comment with a grain of salt, that there is a Narnia or there is a new Middle Earth. And the best version of it is the Christian view of heaven that is really real. When that person's up above their body screaming at the doctor, don't beat on my chest, don't beat on my chest, or they're saying to their spouse in the room, I'm okay, don't worry about me. And nobody looks up and says, wow, thanks for the encouragement. They don't know they're there. That person's in an alternate view of reality. So if you say, where's your evidence for alternate views of reality? I'll say another world. I'd say, look at NDEs. So, by the way, I was in a dialogue with one of the best known skeptics in the world. He's extremely well known. And he said, why should I believe in the resurrection? What is there about the world that I don't know? And I said, you want to talk about NDEs? And he literally said to me, I don't want to talk about NDEs. The data for NDEs are so powerful that they give Christians an in on another world. And now, if you've got to agree with the 6 facts and we know there's another reality, what is your problem except that you've got a worldview? You are prejudiced a priori against taking my view. What else do you have but prejudice?
So. Yeah, and I think that that's just a powerful point. Apologetics is that, you know, if you're going to talk about the historicity of the resurrection, you really have to follow the kind of the rabbit holes of historiography, of how you write history. You have to come up with explanations for historical events that account for all the data. If you're not willing to do that and you're just arguing metaphysics, well, don't critique people who are actually trying to come up with historical explanations for these data.
Right.
And for me, you know, one of the most interesting ones is the point that you made. I think it was either your third or your fourth point about high Christology. It's always striking that I don't know that there's any, you know, you can understand a sort of natural evolution where you start with a human and over time they get deified, right? Because of legends accrete and miracle stories or, you know, political power or whatever. So over time, maybe, you know, you can say, well, yeah, Buddha was deified and miracles were attributed to him, you know, centuries later. The problem is that nobody deified Buddha or attributed miracles to him at the earliest data, but the reverse is true of Jesus. The earliest that we know about him is when the disciples are calling him Lord, which isn't just, you know, master, it's God. And that's, I mean, you have to explain that. If you're not willing to explain that, then you're no longer engaging in history. And it, you know, don't critique a Christian who's trying to come up with a reasonable explanation of the historical data. Let me ask you 2 more questions as we kind of wrap up. The next to last question is this. You've been studying this for, you know, over 50 years. In fact, the book that I mentioned, which is your most recent book, was actually your doctoral dissertation in 1975. And so this has been kind of a huge theme of your entire career as an academic. How has studying this topic over the last 50 years changed you personally as a follower of Jesus?
Great question. I went through a long period of doubt, very long, 10 straight years and 10 more intermittent years, 20 years. And I've just been saying this recently because it just dawned on me. My 20 years of doubt were framed by two deaths by the two most important people in my life. The first death was my great grandmother, who someone could say, "Oh yeah, well she couldn't be the one," but everybody in my family knew she was even my parents knew she was the most important person to me in the world, and she died. And then at the end, over 20 years later, I ended my doubts, and a few years after that time, my wife died of stomach cancer. Now, she's the mother of my 4 children, my best friend. I didn't know how I could live without her. Everything was peachy. We had a great life, loved it. And then all of a sudden, she's gone very quickly. She died 4 months after diagnosis because stomach cancer is so virulent. And I realized these events in my life, the famous problem of suffering, is what framed my doubt. But when I was really convinced that the resurrection works, and I started working on the minimal facts argument, you can tell from reading the book Risen Indeed, the beginning of it happened in my dissertation back in 75, and I've just grown and grown and grown since then. And her death was 20 years after my dissertation. I'd already come a long way, and I was more convinced as time went on. My doubts have never returned, and I'm surprised because I'm a doubter type personality, and I just don't even care what a person says. I tell my students, just let it roll off don't take these doubts seriously, because you've got something they can't answer. And if it's the resurrection, and that says, as I said earlier, that we'll all be raised the same way almost 20 times in the New Testament, we've got something, a belief that's out of this world, literally, which takes us to that other world that we know exists. That's what near-death experiences, many other arguments are about. There's many arguments for God's existence, which would say he's not of this world. So many good arguments for this other world. So over the years, what's happened is the belief in the resurrection has steeled, Steeled, me so much that I feel like I'm impervious to any comebacks. I just think there's nothing out there that bothers us. It should be at all. In fact, just recently, Lee Strobel said that when he became a Christian and started going to college campuses, he realized something. He thinks the battle for truth has been won, and young people in universities don't want to argue truth anymore. They want to argue, what difference does your message mean to me? If I can't make a living with this, if this isn't going to make me be able to raise a family, something's lacking in your message. Well, we don't look at it that way. But my point is, maybe we've won the truth battle. Maybe. Now, people would scoff at us when we say that. But if they said that to me, if they said that's a bunch of baloney and they scoff at it, I would say, hey, you're welcome to offer a naturalistic theory. Let's go at it. And they don't. No, I'm not going to do that right now. All right, then quit telling me what you're telling me. So to me, the resurrection has steeled me in a way that I think it's impervious to good comebacks. And if Christ is raised, now I got to say, and here's the big question, why would God have raised him from the dead? As I tell people, dead men don't do much. So if Jesus was raised from the dead, somebody else had to have acted upon his dead body. He said it was going to be his Father. And there's no resurrections of major founders or major religions. You don't find that in Orthodox theology in any other group. So if God did that to Jesus, why? To say he was a heretic? I don't think so. To say we shouldn't be believing him? No, it doesn't follow either. What follows? God made this the evidence. The Father made this the way to him, and Jesus did it best and said it best. So to me, it lines the whole thing up, and now there's a worldview that backs this up. There's nothing like this. So the effect that it's had on me is, A, getting me through my doubts, B, helping me understand the deaths of these two people in my lives and help me solve the problem of evil, and C, steeling me against anything that can be brought up. And I try to pass that on to my my graduate students that they can leave with that same kind of assurance, so that when they go out into ministry, and of my PhD students, maybe 1/3 of them are already professors. So let them take that into the classroom, and I hope we raise a generation of people who don't have to worry about facts. They can concentrate on the ministry because the facts are settled.
So here's my last question. If people want to follow you online or via social media, and I think that people might want to do that because, with over 30 books authored or co-authored, I don't know, would you estimate a couple hundred articles? I don't know how much you've written.
Yeah, I don't even. I was sitting here thinking while you said that. I'm not sure where you got the even my bio. I've written 45 books now, and half of them are on the resurrection. But I'm doing a magnum opus right now of a huge 4-volume work on the resurrection, which you say, well, all right, so you got 22 books ish, 22-ish on the resurrection. Yeah. So I get it. You're doing a big magnum opus that puts them all together. Nope. So far, I just sent the first volume to the publisher. It's on the evidence only for the resurrection. What we've been discussing is 1,300 pages long. That's volume 1. And I used almost nothing from anything I'd ever published before. It's new material. And so that's how much the material is out there. Where I do this, I would love people to, there's nothing for sale on my website or YouTube. I don't sell my books. I don't care if people buy them or not, frankly. My website is GaryHabermas.com, GaryHabermas.com, and my YouTube can just put my name into the YouTube channel, and I've got 130, 140 lectures or short interviews, anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour and a half, and they can see all of this: handling doubt, near-death experiences, evidence for the resurrection. I would send them there. And I hope they make use of the items on the website, GaryHabermas.com, or on the YouTube site. I do that strictly for ministry. One last thing, George, when you say what effect has it had on me, besides stealing me, I don't just say it steals me against the world, and I want to keep telling people this. I would say one more thing. A little while ago, it was really in the 90s, and it's been coming on since then. I've been convicted that if these things are really true, I've got to do more than just write. I've got to do more than happenstance lectures like the one I just returned from at major universities or big churches or whatever. I'm interested in ministry more than I ever have before. I want to know how this message really, literally changes lives. I'm interested in using this material to make a difference. And just before we went on the air, I opened up a free book that I've been given by a fellow who just published this book with a major company. It's on theology. And he wrote at the beginning, as I opened it up, he said to Gary, he said, I want you to know that your stuff on the resurrection kept me in my last moments from deconstructing from Christianity into another religion. It was your writings that helped me. And I thought to myself, that's where I want to be. I want to be in a life where Christians who are so readily attacked in the world, I want them to be able to see that there are other options. And if the resurrection does that for them, that's what I want to be about, is ministering these things to people who will keep them from deconstructing in an age where people are falling away from the Lord, as if we just believe their testimony. They may not be, but in their words, they're falling away like never before. That's what I think we need to come alongside those folks.
Boy, that connection between theology and ministry. I think that's just biblical, right? The disciples saw Jesus raised and they started preaching right away. So that's a really great insight. I am intrigued, though, by this 4-volume thing because I love to read books. So when's the first volume going to come out? Who's going to publish it?
It's coming out with Brabham & Holman Academic, and the first volume, I just sent it in. It takes a long time for them to edit 1,300 pages. Then I have to respond to their editing. Then they have to do it. Then they have to send it off to the page people. They have to send it off to the binding people. They're saying the first volume won't be out till January 24, which is a year and a half from now. And they say that that's really pushing to just get something big like this out in a year and a half. I just turned it in. And that's the first one. The second volume, we've been talking about it here. There's no book in print that I know of, and this is the area I research, that deals with naturalistic theories more than Mike Lacona's excellent work on the resurrection of Jesus. He was a student of mine, and let me recommend his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, InterVarsity Academic. Great 750-page. It was his dissertation at a secular school on the resurrection. And he came out with this thing now, and his book has 250 pages against naturalistic theories. Well, that's great. It's the longest in print. Probably third is Mike's and my co-authored book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And it's got 100 pages against naturalistic theories. Mike's 250. My next volume is 1,100 pages, and it's totally devoted to refuting naturalistic theories. So we go down through every theory you can think of, and it's done. But I'm proofreading it right now, and it's due to the publishers in January. Then that will be a year and a half before it comes out. So that's the first 2 volumes of 4. The last volume, volume 4, says, hey, we got the evidence. How can we change lives with this? And the 4th volume, which is also 1,100 pages, talks about worldview, ministry, what can pastors do, what can lay people do who are doubting, what about the problem of pain and evil, what about when, like my wife, what happens when the dearest person in your life dies? How are you going to respond? It applies resurrection to all that. So from first to last, 4 big volumes. Each volume is going to be in printed pages. You shrink the manuscript when you print it. Each book, they're saying, they've given me the page numbers, is slated for between 750 and 1,100 pages. So these are going to be 4 volumes that are each about 200 pages longer than Mike Lacona or Tom Wright's excellent work, The Resurrection of the Son of God. So it's a lot of material, but I'm writing it for one reason, George. I'm not writing this. There's no money in writing books like this. You get Lee Strobel's best-selling books.
Right.
Now, I love Lee, and I love what he does. He interviewed me for Case to Christ, so that's wonderful. But I'm not doing it for money. I'm doing it because I want these 4 volumes to be out there so that Christians know there are answers when they're going through deep water, whether it's loss of a loved one, whether it's doubt, whether it's considering their best friend is quote-unquote deconstructed from Christianity. What can we do? And I don't care if they buy the books or not. I just want them to know whose library has them, what church has it, what university has it, so they can get this stuff and read it. So I am really working out what I told you at the end, that I'm doing this strictly for ministry.
I've been talking to Dr. Gary Habermas about the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Dr. Habermas, this has really been an information bonanza of a conversation. And as a reader, I've already chalked in my calendar to look for your book in 2024, which is a year and a half away. So I'm going to be praying that God gives you a long, long, long life to complete this project. But anyway, thank you for joining me on the Influence podcast today.
Well, I've had a great time. I will say on your behalf, George, I do a lot of interviews, hundreds. And I seldom find somebody. I can tell by your questions that you do a lot of reading, and a lot of people don't make nuances when they ask questions. They ask a general question and there's several meanings to it, but you kept hitting the nail on the head, and you kept getting the nuance is exactly the point that I want to discuss, as if you had studied all this stuff yourself, and I'm sure you have, or you couldn't ask questions like that. And so I want to tell you that you've done an excellent job in this interview. I've appreciated very much doing this with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been the Influence Podcast, a collection of inspiring and challenging conversations aimed at empowering the entire spectrum of church leadership, from lead pastor to lead volunteer. Visit influencemagazine.com/podcast to see our library of podcasts with Christian leaders. Make sure to like, review, and share them with your friends. Until the next episode of the Influence Podcast, may God continue to bless you richly today and every day.